Today I'm reading Revealing America's Dark-Skinned Past, Volume 2, The Columbian Era, by Red Silver Fox Thunderbird. The table of contents, it has the introduction, and then slaves make more profit than gold. It appears to me that the people are indigenous and would be good servants. The tribute, followed by no mercy was shown to age or sex. Then they seem to show up in the slave markets as Negroes. And then the epilogue, something about the author, and the bibliography. The misconceptions that permeate American history, especially the United States history, are so numerous and abundant that when people are presented with historical facts that deviate from the customary perceptions, they have a tendency to dismiss the information as another conspiracy theory. The old stories, from the discovery of the New World to the colonization of the United States, are filled with so many fallacies that the retelling of these over the centuries has turned these fictions into truths. The misrepresentations of previous historical writings have become today's realities of the past, not realizing that history has become, using the words of Napoleon, a myth that men agree to believe. One of the most prevalent fallacies in North American history is the story surrounding Christopher Columbus and the people he encountered. It is interesting to note that early 20th century histories were stating that Christopher Columbus was trying to prove that the world was round. However, late 19th century historical writings on Columbus, not school textbooks, make no mention of this revelation. They do, however, tell in great detail of the carnage that took place on the islands during Columbus's reign. They also describe in detail the hospitableness of the indigenous people, the gentle nature of the indigenous people until they had to defend themselves, and that the indigenous people were considered Negroes. Eventually, in the retelling of this story, as history has a tendency to do, facts were being deleted. The man who changed modern history could not be depicted as a slaver, amongst other things. And most of all, the image of the indigenous people and the words and names used to describe them had to be changed to accommodate European interest and values. As you read this book, it is with great anticipation that you will discover that there is much to learn about the history of the people of color on this land mass of North America. We must realize that it was an intention before Columbus left Spain to cross the Atlantic Ocean. Again, I will repeat that. We must realize that it was an intention before Columbus left Spain to cross the Atlantic Ocean to subjugate the indigenous people that would be encountered. We must realize that the people Columbus encountered were used as slaves, and that the shipping of some of those captured indigenous people back to Spain was the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade. We must realize that the Negroid people of the islands were no different in the eyes of the European than the Negroid people of Africa. Both of these cultures to the European were fair objects of raping, captivity, and slavery. The next chapter is Slaves Make More Profit Than Gold. It is written in the Columbus logs that on the first day of his arrival to the New World, the indigenous people of the islands came swimming to the boats, bringing parrots, balls of cotton thread, javelins, and many other things which they exchanged for articles we gave them, such as glass and hawks' bells. It is interesting that Columbus brought along hawks' bells to trade with the Native Americans. Arthur Leo Weiner, in his book Africans and the Discovery of America, stated, "We carried such bells specifically for the purpose of trading with the Indians, no doubt because voyagers to Africa had found them acceptable to the Negroes, who used the rattles and bells in their fetish ceremonies. This means that Columbus knew before he left Spain that he was going to be encountering Negroes or dark-skinned people in the New World. But how would he have come upon this information, and who were these voyagers? To get a better understanding of how this transpired, one must examine circumstances that preceded Columbus's initial voyage. What became known as the Age of Discovery or the Age of Exploration grew out of the Europeans' desire for wealth. Many European rulers knew that trade with Asia could make them rich, powerful, and wealthy. However, the inland route to Asia had been impassable for centuries because of the Muslim and Arab domination of those trade routes. The only alternative was an approach by sea. The Portuguese, because of their proximity to the Atlantic Ocean, were the first Europeans to venture down the coast of Africa in search of this route and the first to establish the trading post along the west coast. In 1441, the Portuguese for the first time obtained gold dust from the traders on the west coast of Africa. The following years, Portuguese explorers returned from Africa with more gold dust and other cargo. By 1445, the Portuguese established their first trading post, slave market / fort, in Arguim Bay, which in the present day is called Mauritania. Up until 1448, only 927 slaves were bought from Mauritania. By 1456, 800 to 1,000 slaves came from that area every year. Eventually, developing royal trade in Western Africa took precedence over establishing trade in India. The Portuguese continued to venture down the western coast of Africa, setting up more trading posts, culminating in 1482 with the establishment of Elmina on the Gold Coast of Western Africa. The Portuguese, by this time, through various treaties, gained exclusive rights to the trade along the western African coast, and the building of Elmina was to secure the gold and slaves as royal monopoly for Portugal. The royal family even demanded that all merchants had to receive a royal license to do business at the Portuguese trading posts. One such person to receive a license was Christopher Columbus. Columbus started sailing at an early age, traversing the Mediterranean Sea, developing his trading and navigational skills as part of the Mediterranean trade. While in his 20s, he moved to Portugal after being shipwrecked in 1476 near the town of Lagos. In 1478, he married Filipa Perostrello, the daughter of a Portuguese noble. He was then sailing on missions for Portuguese government from Lisbon all the way to Elmina. It was around this time that Columbus started to entertain the thought of venturing west to lands across the ocean. It was also at this time that Columbus ran into his brother Bartholomew, who not only was working out of Lisbon as a mariner, but also was a cartographer, a creator of maps and charts. And he created many maps of the Atlantic Ocean. There are some historians who say that it was Christopher with his navigational skills along with his brother Bartholomew with his knowledge of the Atlantic, who thought of the plan together to travel to the Indies by a western route. Even the King of Portugal, Don Juan, knew of these faraway lands which the mariners and traders in his African services had spoken. Don Juan was even regretful that he did not finance Columbus's expedition, for if he had, he believed he would have been the emperor of two continents. Not only was it known that there were lands to the west, it was also known that to the south and to the southeast lay another world. The king was certain of this. Africans, he said, had traveled to that world. In fact, boats had been found which started out from Africa and navigated to the west with merchandise. You see, these two cultures, Africans and Native Americans in the 1400s, before Columbus journeyed to the Americas, had a history with each other. The indigenous American and the African people have interacted with each other in a variety of settings and situations. These interactions may well have begun in the very ancient times. It was also knowledge that Columbus gained from interacting with African mariners and traders that was a precursor of the voyages to the New World. Columbus was not only planning for a western route to the Indies, he knew from his interactions with the African traders that there was gold in those faraway lands. One must also presume that while interacting with the African traders, Columbus found out information about the inhabitants of the faraway lands and knew they were of Negroid stock, which means another possible source of slaves. Even though gold was a profitable market in the world, slaves made more profit than gold. The Portuguese knew this from experience, and Columbus knew this from his experience with the Portuguese and his personal involvement with the African traders and the African slave trade into the Mediterranean. He had intentions from the start of enslaving the Negro inhabitants from the faraway land. Many historians had recorded that the purpose of Columbus's journey was to find another route to the spice markets of China and Japan. The land route had been dominated for centuries by the Arabs and the Muslims, and the European countries had been trying for centuries to find a new route to bypass them. In the 1480s, Columbus started asking for assistance to finance a new route to the Spice Islands westerly by sea. He first went to the King of Portugal, who turned him down repeatedly. At that time, the king's interest was the trade in Western Africa, which he took precedence over establishing any new trade routes to India and Asia. After years of trying to procure funds in Portugal, Columbus left and moved to Spain with his brother. Columbus's brother Bartholomew and Columbus traveled to other countries to try to obtain the funding, but both returned to Spain with no results. Columbus was in Spain for 6 years before he finally received a royal proclamation from the King and Queen of Spain. This occurred after Spain finally won their independence from the Moors after the fall of Granada, which ended 8 centuries of the Muslim domination of the Iberian Peninsula. Now that Spain was at peace, it could now devote their energies to other ventures and finance Columbus's journey. Next chapter, it appears to me that the people are indigenous and would be good servants. Before embarking on his voyage, Columbus started his log, a daily report of sightings, weather conditions, daily life on the ships, etc. His first entry describes the positions of the king and queen of Spain and how Columbus acquired their graces for his new endeavor. Whereas most Christian, high, excellent, and powerful princes, kings, and queens of Spain and of islands of the sea, our sovereigns, this present year 1492, after your highness had terminated the war with the Moors reigned in Europe, your highness, as Catholic Christians and princesses who love and promote the holy Christian faith and are enemies of the doctrine of Mohammed and all of the idolatry and her heresy, determined to send me, Christopher Columbus, to the above-mentioned countries of India, to see the same princes, peoples, and territories, and to learn their dispositions and the proper method of converting them to our holy faith, and therefore directed that I should not proceed by land to the east, as is customary, but by a western route. It is interesting to note that there is no mention of obtaining gold or spices, and if one was just reading this to determine the purpose of the trip, you would have to conclude that it was to learn the temperament of the people and then to convert them to Christianity. Consequently, on the day of his arrival to the New World, he wrote in his log, "As I saw that they were very friendly to us, and perceived that they could be much more easily converted to our holy faith by gentle means than by force." Upon his arrival to the New World, it was compulsory of Columbus to read a declaration which later became termed the requirement. The purpose of the requirement was to absolve all Spaniards of any responsibility for the depravity and horror of their actions wherever they set foot in the New World. So, on October 11th, 1492, Columbus called his captains and all of his crew to bear witness that he before all others took possession, as in fact he did, of the island for the king and queen and his sovereigns, making all requisite declarations. One of the many requirements issued stated, in part, "In the name of King Ferdinand and Juana, his daughter, Queen of Castile-Leon, conquerors of the barbarian nations, we notify you, the best we can, that our Lord God, eternal, created heaven and earth. The late Pope gave these islands and mainland of the ocean and the continents, therefore, to the above-mentioned King and Queen, as in certified in writing, and you may see the documents if you so desire. Therefore, we request that you understand this text within a reasonable time and recognize that the Church and its highest priest, the Pope, as rulers of the universe, and in their name, the King and Queen as rulers of this land, allowing the religious fathers to preach our holy faith to you. Should you fail to comply or delay maliciously in doing so, we assure you that with the help of God, we shall use force against you, declaring war upon you from all sides with all possible means. We shall enslave your persons, wives, and sons, sell you or dispose of you as the king sees fit. We shall seize your possessions and warn you as much as we can as disobedient and resisting vassals. And we declare you guilty of resulting debts and injuries, exempting their highnesses of such guilt, and as well as ourselves and the gentlemen who accompany us." After Columbus's initial statement that the people he encountered were friendly, he proceeded to say, "It appears to me that the people are indigenous and would be good servants." And 3 days later states, "When your highnesses order it, all can be taken and carried to Castile or held captives on the island itself, because with 50 men all can be subjugated and made to do everything which is desired." It should now be obvious that Columbus' plans were not only to convert the inhabitants to Christianity, but also to enslave them. To incite the native people of the islands, offering tokens and gifts, all of the meanwhile planning to enslave them and convert them to Christianity. He informed his crew not to barter with the inhabitants, so that when your highnesses send another expedition to these parts, it may meet with a friendly reception. However, immediately after he arrived at the islands, Columbus took a number of natives by force and kept them on the ship. These natives became basically tour guides for Columbus, directing him around various islands in his quest to find gold and to determine the dispositions of the inhabitants. On subsequent trips around the islands, Columbus detained more of the native people. On one trip, 5 youths came on board, whom I, Columbus, ordered to be detained, in order to have them with me. He then sent ashore to one of the houses and took 7 women and 3 children. He says he did this that the Indians, who already had in his custody, might tolerate their captivity better with their company. His detainees, however, had no clue of what was to come. They probably thought they were tour guides, as Columbus stated on one of his latter voyages around the islands, that they were already suspicious because he did not shape a course back towards their country. As Columbus ventured around the islands, observing the inhabitants and their behaviors, he continued to express thoughts about enslaving them, while he wrote that they were very gentle, the best people in the world, friendly, and so timid that 1,000 would not stand before 3 of our men. He also expressed that his plans were for them on his return trip, writing in his logs several times in various ways. They are good to be ordered about, to work and sew, and do all that may be necessary, and to build towns, and they should be taught to go about clothed and to adopt our customs. Before his departure from the islands, he even referred to the Native Americans as now subjects of the King of Castile. It is believed that when Columbus returned to Spain, from his first venture he detained approximately 25 Native Americans. Upon his arrival in Spain, Columbus dressed these Native Americans in their finest indigenous attire, inclusive of many gold trinkets, along with various indigenous plants and animals from the Americas, and paraded and displayed them in order to convey any idea of the importance and the wealth of their newly discovered country. It is said that the original intention of Columbus for these detainees to learn more of the language and customs of Spain and return them back home to the islands. No one knows how many of these Native Americans were aboard the ships on a second route. However, it is mentioned that 2 were returned to the islands, where 1 immediately upon arriving escaped into the interior of the island. While the accounts of the people of the islands initially were of timid, gentle, friendly people, Columbus's description on his return trip changed dramatically, as if he now needed to have in writing that the people needed him and needed to be civilized. It also appears that from this point forward in history, that the indigenous people of the Americas are spoken about in a negative fashion. This seems to begin when Columbus returns to the islands on his second voyage and cannot find the settlement of his crew he left behind. Towards the end of Columbus's first voyage, one of his ships, the Santa Maria, ran aground and was not able to be fully repaired. Columbus and his crew, along with the inhabitants of Marion, that section of the island, used the salvaged remains of the Santa Maria to build a settlement for the crew members who had been left behind when Columbus made his return trip to Spain. The indigenous inhabitants, under the leadership of their principal chief, Guancanagari, not only helped with the building of this settlement, which Columbus named La Navidad, they helped to provide provisions, as many of the inhabitants of the islands did for their visitors. When Columbus returned on his second voyage, he found La Navidad in complete ruins. At first, it was feared that there had been treachery on the part of Guancanagari, in whom the admiral had reposed confidence and friendship. But the accounts given by the natives tend to dispel this fear, and to convince the Spaniards that the colonists had perished from other causes. Some of them, it was said, had died of sickness. Some had fallen in quarrels among themselves, and some, having gone to other parts of the island, had taken Indian wives and adopted the customs of the natives. The Spaniards were still not convinced that the native people were not responsible for the destruction of the encampment. However, after some exploration, they found out that the tribal village of the Guancanagari also shared in the disaster and had befallen the settlement. While it is recorded that the destruction of the settlement was at the hands of some native inhabitants, what is not readily available is the evidence of the behavior of the Spaniards who were left behind and led to the destruction, whereas it is true that some of the Spaniards died of natural causes, and some retreated inland with native wives. What is usually omitted is of the outrageous conduct of the men Columbus left behind. The men who were recruited from Spain to be the crew for the first voyage were not exactly what would be described as your upstanding citizens. Because of the difficulty Columbus had in recruiting a crew for his initial voyage, the King and Queen of Spain made a proclamation that every person that became a member of Columbus's crew was to be exempt from all hindrance and incommodity, either in their persons or goods, and that they were privileged from arrest or detention on account of any offense or crime which may have been committed by them during the time they may have been on the voyage, and for 2 months after their return to their homes. This enticed all sorts of undesirable personnel to be lured as crew members on this perilous voyage. The crew, often described as being a refuge for runaway criminals and debtors, included 4 men condemned to death, 1 for murder and 3 for trying to free him from prison. Columbus even later confessed that the men recruited did not deserve water from God or man. These criminals would not only be absolved of all previous crimes they committed, they would be pardoned of any crimes committed in the New World. Columbus's entire crew knew there would be no repercussions of any kind of wrongdoings that they may commit during the entire voyage, or any they may commit against the native people. Pardoning this type of behavior was not out of the norm for explorers, for it was the opinion of the church that at the time all barbarous and infidel nations who shut their ears to the truths of Christianity were fair objects of raping, captivity, and slavery. Since the Native Americans did not practice Christianity, even though it was known that they were a spiritual people, they were ill-treated, and the Spaniards were basically given permission to, as previously stated, sell or dispose of the people, seize the possessions, and harm them as being disobedient. Columbus often wrote in his logs that the native people believed and know that there is a God in heaven. However, this could not save them from the carnage that was soon to befall these unsuspecting people. While Columbus's first trip was one of discovery and exploration, it appears that the subsequent voyages were for the discovery of gold and the exploitation of the indigenous inhabitants of the islands. Now that Columbus was a Spanish noble and admiral of the seas, titles he received from the King and Queen of Spain, he was able to gather 1,500 people crowded into 17 vessels for the second journey. The first journey had approximately 90 individuals. The exaggeration of the gold and riches that could be found in what they believed to be Asia was enough to convince many seeking wealth and fortune to venture across the ocean. Whereas the first trip's crew was mainly composed of criminals and men seeking to avoid their debts or incarceration, the crew that was recruited for the second voyage was of a higher class of people. These were men who could afford to pay their way, and they were men who were not used to manual labor. They believed they were embarking on an adventure where fortunes could be acclimated without much effort. They were, for the most part, young men of roving and adventurous dispositions, with no homes or morals, who came on the expedition because it was believed that the Indies were composed entirely of gold. They had no intentions of working or making themselves useful. Even though these men came from higher classes in society, their moral values were essentially equivalent to those of the first crew. Gold and riches were the main objective of these new crew members, and they would acquire these by any means necessary. The tribute. The arrival of the second voyage and the discovery of destruction of La Navidad, Columbus went about finding a new location for his colony so he could continue his quest for gold. Following the establishment of the new settlement called Isabella, the Spaniards went about their mission of finding gold, often leaving the farms they were cultivating unattended because the men knew nothing of farming, and they did not accompany this trip to do manual labor. Combine the fact that the colonists could not find the gold in large quantities that they were expecting, along with the labor that was expected of them, you have a recipe for turmoil. These outcomes led to the beginning of an oppressive treatment of the indigenous inhabitants of the islands, a policy that was continued unto the U.S. mainland and did not end for centuries. One of the first demands of the native people took from the system that would augment the Spaniards' gold stores and food supplies. Columbus assigned a tribute on the native populations of the island, where it was expected that every Indian above 14 years old who was in the vicinity of the mines was required to pay every 3 months a little bellyful of gold, and to take for it a brass or tin token, and to wear this about the neck as a receipt or evidence that payment had been made. All persons not living in the vicinity of the mine were every 3 months to pay 25 pounds of cotton. Guarionex, the principal chief of Magua, which is the part of the island surrounding Isabella, who up until this time had been faithful to Columbus, tried to convince him to modify his order because he insisted that they did not know how to collect the gold, and the amounts that he was requesting would be impossible for them to collect. Columbus did not realize that the gold that the native inhabitants had in their possessions was nothing more than jewelry that had been crafted and passed down over the generations. Initially, Columbus refused the humble demands of the chief, but soon he realized that the required amount of gold could not be found. As time passed on, it was found that personal service was the only form of tax that could readily be enforced, and accordingly, more and more of the natives were driven into working the farms and mines of the Spanish settlements. The native inhabitants were not content with the work being forced upon them, and many began to flee to the mountains to avoid their deplorable existence. The native people even tried an attempt to force their unwanted visitors out of the islands. When they noticed how dependent the Spaniards were on the provisions they produced, they destroyed crops and left the farms in waste and retreated further inland to the mountains where they could hide and survive on the roots and herbs there. They voluntarily endured hardships rather than to submit to treatments inflicted on them by the conquerors. The plan was successful for only a short time because the Spaniards still had their resources from home, but also because the inlanders had to leave their own farms unattended. It was not long before the native people were suffering themselves. The plan also angered the Spaniards, who were now advancing into the mountains from town to town to pursue fleeing workers, and they accomplished this with the unrelenting fury. Villages were burned to ashes. The feeble were mercilessly massacred. Shrieking victims were slashed down by sabers of the Spaniards. They ripped open the bellies of pregnant women, took out the tiny infants and cut them into pieces. Children were taken by their feet, and their heads were dashed against rocks. Hands were cut off and lay dangling by flaps of skin. Ferocious dogs pursued the helpless victims and devoured those that they caught. Others were hung, and still others were burned alive. The Spaniards wanted to display their dominance, inspire terror amongst the islanders, and frighten the entire island into submission. The natives who did survive these vicious attacks only found themselves in more despair by being corralled onto the 5 ships that had recently returned from Spain, and they were held captive on these ships until they were to depart back to Spain. By the time the journey was ready to depart, 1,600 native inhabitants had been captured. 500 of the healthiest between the ages of 12 and 35 were selected to carry to Spain to be sold there in slave markets. The rest of the captors were distributed amongst the settlers. This action was the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade, a policy of utilizing the once entitled, gentle, and friendly native inhabitants who are now being described as savage, wild, and cruel, and using them as a commodity to obtain funds to finance building colonies in the newly discovered lands. Columbus was revising a plan of old to use the island settlements. It was a plan that was profitable for him when he was working for the Portuguese along the African coast to capture the natives, send them to Spain, and sell them to the slave markets. Columbus established that as many slaves could be furnished as the Spanish market would demand, and from the species of traffic, a revenue of as much as 40 million maravedis, Spanish coins, might be derived. He even devised a plan where the colonists could furnish slaves to the ship captains and receive articles from Spain when the ship returned. The plan had all the cold-hearted brutality of a practiced slave dealer. Next chapter. No mercy was shown to age or sex. Among the persons who were being held for shipment to Spain was Cayanabo, the principal chief of Maguana. He was accused by Chief Guancanagari of the destruction of La Navidad. Cayanabo was a very powerful and respectful chief, and was considered the Spaniards' most formidable enemy. He was angry that visitors had invaded the islands and built a fort in his dominion without his consent. He was also infuriated that the Spaniards had demanded a tribute from his people, and even more so, he was incensed of the cruel and savage behavior of the colonizers, and he wanted them off of the island. Cayanabo, along with the other principal chiefs of the island, devised a plan to rid the Spaniards from Hispaniola. When the Spaniards received word of the plot through Guancanagari, the only chief who refused to be part of the plot against the Spaniards, they concocted a plan to capture Cayanabo. The Spaniards were hell-bent at bringing Chief Cayanabo to justice for the destruction of La Navidad. Guancanagari was the first chief on the island to ally with Columbus and to become compliant to Columbus's demands. When his village was destroyed along with La Navidad, Columbus promised him protection from Cayanabo for his loyalty. Cayanabo allegedly destroyed the villages because the Spaniards, in Columbus's absence, committed numerous crimes against the native people, and he allegedly destroyed Guancanagari's village in response to his loyalty to the strangers. The Spanish arranged a fake meeting with Cayanabo and his villagers. He was presented with numerous gifts, among them some shiny handcuffs. Cayanabo was fascinated with shiny objects, so he was immediately drawn to them. The Spaniards told him he should try them on, and Cayanabo obliged. Once the handcuffs were secured, the Spaniards took custody of him and carried him back to their ships, where he was held captive until the ships sailed back to Spain. He, however, never made it to Spain. He died along the way. So with Cayanabo out of the way and Guancanagari under Columbus's thumb, Columbus was well on his way to regulating the entire island. Guaranics has now even submitted to the Spaniards, even offering his daughter to Columbus's brother. The chief who now stood the most in his way was Behichio, chief of the most populous area of the island, Waragua, and his sister Anacoata, wife of Cayanabo, who appeared to share equal responsibilities as the chief of Waragua. Upon Columbus's initial visit to Waragua, he was able to successfully negotiate a tribute from that section of the island. Behichio was actually surprised and relieved of Columbus's actions. He believed Columbus was going to capture him because of his alliance and personal relationship with Cayanabo. Behichio, who later died of natural causes, and Anacaana, who was described as one of the most beautiful women of the island, and who took over as the primary chief, remained loyal to Columbus for years. Be that as it may, by the early 1500s, because of the deplorable conditions that the people of the island had endured, it was believed by the Spaniards that Anacaana and the people of Waragua were planning to conspire against them. Under the leadership of Commander Ovando, who was part of the charge while Columbus was in Spain, 300 soldiers armed with guns, swords, and crossbows, and 70 horsemen in full armor with lances proceeded to Waraguar under the pretense of collecting their tribute. Anacaona, upon hearing that Ovando was on his way, summoned her chiefs and subjects to welcome the Spaniards with the dignity and grace she always exhibited. She entertained them for several days, accommodated them in her best houses, and provided them the best that was available to be bestowed upon them. Still believing that Anacaona was planning a plot against him, Ovando conceived a counterplot, which, on his cue, was carried out with a vengeance. Ovando arranged to entertain the people of Zaragoza with the jousting skill of his soldiers. Anacaona and her chiefs were assembled in the house where Ovando was staying, which looked over the square where the show would be taking place, while the rest of the people of Jaraguá watched from a short distance. None of the chiefs nor the people of Jaraguá were armed, for the entire visit of the Spaniards was received as a friendly visit. Once the horsemen were in place in the square, Ovando gave kill. The house where Anacaona and the chiefs assembled was immediately surrounded, not allowing anyone to escape. The chiefs were bound and tortured until the Spaniards received a confession from the chiefs that Anacaona was plotting against them. Anacaona, captured and taken away where the chiefs were bound, was set on fire, and all of the chiefs, which is said to have been more than 80, perished in the flames. The inhabitants of Jaraguá were then pursued by the horsemen, trampled them under the hoofs of the horses, and stabbing them with the lances, swords, and spears of the Spaniards. No mercy was shown to age or sex. It was a savage and undiscriminate butchery. Several who escaped from the massacre fled in their canoes. They were pursued and taken and condemned to slavery. Anacaona was taken in chains to San Domingo, where a mock trial was given, and she was found guilty by the testimonies that were coerced and tortured from her chiefs. She was then hung in front of her survivors. Her memory is still celebrated today, 5 centuries after her hanging. She is remembered not only as a leader of her people, she is known for the ballads, songs, and poetry she created. The 18th century poet Alfred Lord Tennyson even wrote a poem about her, which he never published, giving various unconvincing reasons, but perhaps providing the real reason in an unguarded comment describing that black bee, Anacaona, and her cocoa-shadowed coves of N-words. I cannot have her strolling about the land in this way. It is neither good for her reputation nor mine. Apparently writing a positive poem about a black person in the 1800s was taboo, but even more than that, it would reveal that the people of the islands were of a Negroid stock. By the early 1500s, the entire island was paying tribute to the Spaniards, and 4 of the 5 primary chiefs of the island were no longer alive. The last living chief, Cotubanama of Higui, was the only thing that stood in the way of total domination of the island. Despite the fact that Cotubanama was compliant with the tribute, constructed a peace treaty, allowed the Spaniards to construct a facility in his dominion, even exchanged names with one of the Spaniards, showing his propensity towards peace. the destructive behavior toward the people of the island continued. The inhabitants of Higui and the entire island over the years had become very cautious and distrustful of the Spaniards' behavior and presence on the island. When the now unwelcome visitors had justifiably released a dog on the unsuspecting chief, resulting in the most brutal of deaths, the people retaliated by killing 8 Spaniards. This action caused a war to be ensued by the Spaniards, which sent the native inhabitants scattering into the mountains for refuge. The women and children that were found in their hiding places were indiscriminately slaughtered. 600 or 700 people were imprisoned in the dwelling, and all were put to the sword. Those of the inhabitants who were spared were carried off as slaves. Realizing the prowess of the Spaniards and their inability to protect themselves against the weapons of the Spaniards, a treaty was ensued, which was to protect the local people, on the condition of them cultivating a large tract of land and paying a great quantity of bread in tribute. When this treaty was broken by the Spaniards, another war supervened. Again, many natives fled to the mountains for refuge, and again they were pursued relentlessly. When they were found, the Spanish spared neither age nor sex. Even pregnant women and mothers with infants in their arms fell beneath their merciless swords. They wanted to instigate fear and terror throughout the island. The Spaniards were now in active pursuit of Cotobanama and his chiefs. They even took prisoners one of his distinguished elderly female chiefs, who was eventually hanged. Cotobanama fled to the small island of Saona, off of the southeastern coast of Higui, with his wife and children, hiding in the recesses of the mountains. After a long pursuit, he was eventually captured. His wife and children escaped from their hideout when hearing the news of Cotobanama. It was then ordered for him to be publicly hanged, which was obligated. His death was followed by the complete subjugation of his people, and sealed the last struggle of the natives against their oppressors. The island was almost unpeopled of its original inhabitants, and meek and mournful submission and mute despair settled upon the scanty remnant that survived. They seemed to show up in slave markets as Negroes. Over the course of Columbus's 4 journeys to the newly found territory, a once populous island that was rich with natural beauty and resources was now virtually depopulated. Some managed to escape by boats to the surrounding islands, and I'm sure because of its close proximity to the mainland United States. Those inhabitants who remained were doomed to a life of deplorable slavery, where there was no escape or hope for the future. By the early 1500s, the demographics of the islands was changing, and the need for slaves was increasing, in part because of the depopulation of Hispaniola, but also because the Europeans were venturing to other parts of the Americas and setting up settlements. The workers for these settlements became the indigenous people, and over time, slave raiding, aka kidnapping, became the standard to obtain these workers. After 1510, Spanish slave raiding reached out increasingly towards the outer islands of the Caribbean and the adjacent mainlands. Much of the raiding was designed to meet the labor needs of Haiti, where the native population was being greatly reduced, but numerous Spanish expeditions captured Native Americans who were taken to Spain. By the 1520s, slave raiding in Florida and the Carolina coast area was common also. In any case, Between the years of 1492 and 1501, at least 3,000 Native Americans were known to be shipped to Europe, with the likely total being possibly doubled that. Most were sent to the Seville area, where they seem to show up in the slave markets as Negroes. What most people don't realize is Negro is a terminology that was used to describe the indigenous people of the Americas. Upon the 17th century, terminologies that were used to describe people were of a non-racial origin because one's appearance as a means of identification and specification was more significant than that of racial ideology. Anyone with a dark complexion, regardless of their country or of origin, was called Negro. And along with the misnomers Indian, Negro was also used to define indigenous people. We make a huge mistake when we apply 21st century sensibilities to terminologies that were created in the past. There were many terms in many different languages that were utilized to define the people of color here in the United States, and many times these terms' meanings change over time. Some terms like pardo, loro, preto, and moreno, just to mention a few, were all terms used to define people with dark complexions that have since become obsolete. Even the terminology brown, as used to define people, is not used in the same manner it was used in the 1600s. In actual practice, English brown was originally a very dark color. Mulatto is another terminology which started out meaning the mixture of Native Americans and Africans, which eventually became to mean the mixture of whites and blacks. It is interesting to note here that the English terminology black became to be used in an all-encompassing way to describe all shades of people of color. What is also fascinating is how it has become concealed that the indigenous people of the Americas were once considered to be Negroes, that they were the first slaves utilized in the Americas, and their transportation to Spain began what was originally termed the African slave trade, but has since been properly named the transatlantic slave trade. It is imperative to comprehend that up until recent times, the history of the United States and America has been related to the public through European eyes, European standards, and a European point of view. And as we reread these stories, we must use caution, as these stories depict the changing attitude of a people of a darker complexion, and not necessarily an accurate depiction of actual events. We must comprehend that the changing attitude was as a result of the greed of the Europeans and their desire for wealth, and to gain and control the newly discovered lands, and their need of a servile population that would help to accomplish those goals. It is equally imperative to comprehend that this servile population, while being categorized as Negro, were not necessarily, and in many cases did not arrive here on slave ships from Africa. The brown indigenous people of the Americas were not only the first slaves used here, but were also the first victims of what became the transatlantic slave trade. Lastly, it is imperative to comprehend that the tens of millions of Native Americans who disappeared after 1492 did not all die in the Holocaust inflicted in the Americas. Many thousands were sent to Europe and Africa, where their descendants still live. But more than that, those that disappeared did not disappear at all. They got absorbed in the slave population, got reclassified as African, and many of the descendants of those people are living today as African Americans. And there you have it. Revealing America's Dark-Skinned Past, Volume 2, The Columbian Era, Red Skin Silver Fox, Thunderbird. Says the author's name is Renee Sanders, and she's a co-founder of Indeed Indigenous Education Enrichment and Development, an indigenous nonprofit organization which focuses on educating people of the forgotten and omitted history of the people of color in what is now the United States. She received her formal education at Temple University in Philadelphia, PA, where she received her bachelor's degree in music education. She also received her middle year's certification and reading endorsement from the Atlanta Public Schools in Atlanta, Georgia. Educating people has been a lifetime passion of Renee, having spent over 30 years as a teacher in Philadelphia and Atlanta, where she has taught general music classes, band classes, instrumental music lessons, reading classes, language arts tutoring classes, and health classes. She has also worked as long-term elementary substitute teacher and was also the principal of a private day school. Prior to starting her teaching career, Renee spent several years working with children as a music coach and as a summer camp counselor, drawing on decades of her music teaching experiences where she focused on exposing her students to the evolution of music in America. Renee now focuses on educating people of the underexposed history of the people of color in the United States before and after the arrival of the Europeans. She, along with her son and co-founder in Indeed, Tavis Sanders, have created educational videos that air not only in Philadelphia and New York on cable television, but have also been viewed in over 195 countries on their YouTube channel. Renee is very optimistic that by bringing to light this previously neglected and overlooked information, that people will have a better picture of the past to use to make sense of the present and have the ability to create a better future for bibliography.